at the end of the tournament, there's just absolutely no pitching left for any teams. This is a very common problem. I'm sure you're all well aware of. And so I was asked to pitch. I had started pitching earlier that year. I stepped up to the mound, and I fired a pitch in. And as I landed, my cleat hit the soil in front of the mound, and the bottom level of my cleat, this old pair of Mizunos I'd worn since high school baseball, tore off, and I did not have a backup pair of cleats. To his credit, the umpire, an Irish umpire, offered to let me borrow his cleats. And so mid-game, the umpire and the pitcher swapped cleats. And I then got out of the inning, no runs allowed, one of the best innings I've ever pitched in my life. I asked whether I could maybe buy these cleats off of him. You know, I could see a baseball future ahead of myself for the first time in my life. But instead, I limped home in my trainers. But it was an incredibly enjoyable experience playing on the Emerald Isle.
That was Gabriel Fidler, who writes for MrBaseball.com. That's Mr-Baseball.com. Hello, and welcome to episode 107 of the Irish Baseball Podcast. I'm your host, Rick Becker. Gabriel will be back on the show for the second time to be my guest. As an expert on European baseball, I thought having Gabriel explain the different leagues and levels would help those of us in the U.S. to understand the game on the other side of the Atlantic. I mentioned that Gabriel Fidler has already been on the Irish Baseball Podcast as a guest. Of course, we have more than 100 past episodes of the show that you can go back and listen to by heading to irishbaseball.org. Authors, musicians, players, scouts, coaches, broadcasters, executives, podcast hosts, and so many others have been here to talk about baseball, Ireland, and so much more. Let's get started with today's conversation. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me on. I'm looking forward to it and excited about what you all do.
So can you explain the cup system for the European clubs? I know there's a European Championship Cup, the Baseball European Cup, and the Federation Cup. Are these cups related to each other, and how does it work? And you don't have to go like extremely in depth, but just if we could get a little taste of all three of those particular tournaments.
That's a great question. I could tell you what you were trying to formulate that earlier when the question simply wouldn't quite come to you. And you know what? I totally understand, because Drew Spencer, the manager of Great Britain's national team, asked me a question about the London Mets, who many of the Irish listeners will be familiar with, having played in the same tournaments as Irish teams. And what he asked me was, just how unusual is it that the Mets won a European Cup and a British title and another cup title in the same year? And I thought, with a pretty good knowledge of this cup system and having tracked historically at a basic level, I'd be able to answer fairly quickly. The short answer is it was not. And roughly 5,000 words later, I'd written what turned out to be a large research piece in which I was simply trying to answer the question of, what are these cups and how do they work together? However, I won't go into that much detail for you, and I think I can explain it pretty clearly. There is an organization which runs baseball in Europe. It's called the Confederation of European Baseball. It has recently essentially become the European branch of the World Baseball Softball Confederation, but you still sometimes hear CEB used as an acronym. Though I think it is officially now one and the same as WBSC Europe. CEB historically, beginning in 1963, hosted a cup for the winners of European leagues. But in 1963, the number that were invited was incredibly small. Essentially what happened was, for the next 18 years, through 1981, it's just one tournament, 6 top teams. It then expanded to a qualifying tournament for the next 3 years to round out the 80s. That was pretty straightforward. Since then, what has happened is the CEB created other cups, some of which were qualification cups to this main Champions Cup, and some of which were alternate ones, so that teams which perhaps ought to have qualified but didn't, had another route to winning a cup. And it's a little bit like European football system, where there's the Champions League, but there's also the Europa League. It functioned a little bit like that. As CEB became WBSC in the last few years, the lead up to that, one of the things that happened was this system of cups just way too confusing. There were different cups that qualified, one for another cup, but not for the Champions Cup. And the name of the cups changed, and sometimes a cup would go from being a separate cup for winners of another cup to being the qualification for the Champions Cup, which is what it's traditionally been called. And so this was streamlined in starting in 2008 and officially in 2016. What has happened since then is there's the Champions Cup, there is the variously named either European Cup or CEB Cup. That is a qualifier for the Championship Cup, for the Champions Cup, excuse me. There is a third tier one, which is the Federations Cup, and then there's the Federations Cup qualifier. That is essentially the system that exists now. You might be wondering, well, you've said that there's a Championship Cup and people qualify, but who is qualifying? That question is one that has only really in recent years actually been firmly listed. I won't actually go into specifics about it because there are so many European countries that there are so many European leagues. But essentially what that means is the top leagues in Europe have an automatic bid for the winner of the previous year's league to compete in the Champions Cup the following summer. So in other words, mid-season of the new season. So the winner of the 2023 Cup, league for Europe's top countries automatically has a spot. So it won't necessarily be the same team that was in the cup the previous year, but it will be a team from those countries.
So if we talk about a lower club cup than this top tier, so we know that some of the countries that aren't putting out the top tier clubs can compete in lower level cups, right?
That's right.
Now, if you are a second tier team for the Netherlands, can you compete in those cups so that you have a chance? Maybe your club cup level is a lot higher than, say, Ireland. Can a second tier Netherlands team compete against Ireland for one of those second tier cups?
That's a great question. And it is really interesting that the answer has essentially always been no. Here's what happens regarding countries with programs that are not ranked as highly versus the lower level clubs of one of the top leagues. These cups are regarded as essentially rewards for winning a country's top level national league. So if you don't play in your country's top level national league, you are never eligible. Instead, what you will have to do to compete at a European Cup is qualify for your nation's top league. I suspect many, if not most of your readers are aware that in European baseball, it functions very similarly to football, where there's promotion and relegation. It's not necessarily set, and Ireland is one of the places that does not really have promotion and relegation in the strictest football sense. But I suspect your readers are familiar, your listeners, are familiar with the concept. So a team in the second tier of the Dutch league would never play a European Cup at all. It might play tournaments or friendlies with top teams from other leagues. Ireland instead is more likely to have to work its way up from the very bottom tier of cups, which is the Federations Cup qualifier. And it would then play the winners of other leagues that are in a similar place in their development. Now, you might be wondering, how do these levels work and what does it really mean to be talking about countries at a certain level? If you look at the WBSC World Rankings, that's a pretty good guide. The teams that are in the WBC qualifiers, they are semi-pro leagues and above, with the exception of Great Britain, which has in the past had a few semi-professional players, currently has negligible numbers, only a handful at most. So these countries have mostly semi-professional or better leagues. The ones below it are in these lower tiers. Ireland is more likely to face off against the winners of the national leagues of, for instance, Finland, Estonia, Slovakia, Switzerland, Portugal, countries like this, which have no professional players, but in Ireland's case, and there are some others, have really made strides in development. And it is, I think, quite likely that Ireland goes from hosting Federations Cup qualifiers to, winning Federations Cup qualifiers and then hosting Federations Cup. That seems like the level that Irish National League clubs can be quickly emerging to. What would then happen if an Irish team won and advanced to the Federations Cup from its qualifier? Is that it could then win and then go up to the next level cup, the European Cup or CEB Cup. And what happens with this winning? As you might imagine, you can only play in one cup per year because it's a tiered system. If let's say the Irish League produced the winner of Federations Cup qualifier, Ireland's league would be promoted to the Federations Cup. So let's say it was the Dublin Hurricanes. If the Dublin Hurricanes did not win the next year, it would not be the team to advance to that Federations Cup, but whomever had won in instead of the Hurricanes, as an example. So this means that Ireland, the more it wins, the more chances to play at a higher level that Irish clubs will have. And if they lose, they'll simply drop down a tier rather than be removed from the cup system as a whole.
Wow, this is some really good information. I appreciate it. Just have a few more questions for you. I know back in 2023, Ireland won one of these lower level cup tournaments. Now, what did this team look like? Was it an all-star team? What type of players did Ireland send to this tournament?
That's a fantastic question. The short answer is it's essentially just the club that won its league the previous year, minus off-season changes. So the no club is ever quite the same one year to another. But whatever the newly constituted team is, and in Ireland, I think that's likely to be about 90% the same, it will simply send that team to the Federations Cup qualifier, and from there it will compete, and it will compete against other winners of national leagues from around Europe. Those teams, and this could apply for Ireland, will often make the effort when having won a league to sign a few extra players so that they are able to compete in the cup tournament. So one almost prepares a better roster if one knows that one will be playing in Europe. For the very lowest level teams, where in Ireland it's for the life of the game, and it can be pretty expensive. Most of those players are simply going to be players who play for that Irish team, and that will be true for the other countries as well. The higher one goes up the system, the more likelihood it is that if one is playing in the European Cup, for instance, or the Champions Cup, that one will make a free agent signing. But this is not really the same as European football, wherein qualification for the Champions League means massive amounts of money. It really doesn't mean much money at all. It's really for glory.
So you spent some time playing in Ireland a few years ago. How did that come about, and what do you remember from it?
That's a great story, and I was hoping you would ask. I knew that we would have a huge amount of ground to cover when it comes to European baseball, and if any of you listening have questions, please get a hold of me and ask me them. And you may also find a lot of answers at mrbaseball.com. That's mr-baseball.com. I had the chance to play for the Cavan Comets in 2016 because my baseball club in Britain, Durham University, was a club I had founded that year. And at the time, there was no university baseball league in Britain. So I came up with a schedule of friendlies all across, let's say, both sides of the Irish Sea. And one of the things we did was play the Ulster tournament in 2016, where we opened the brand new ground in Ulster, which was just a great facility. And we were there for essentially opening day and got to play as a British university team in Ireland. It was such an honor. to be able to do this. And this tournament had a mixture of teams from England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Ireland, which was just really, really fun. By the end of the tournament, the Comets were a bit short-handed due to injuries, and they needed a player to fill in. I didn't have any more games left with Durham University, and so I had a chance to suit up for a single game for them. And I actually have a short, funny story about what happened when I did. I am a baseball player of reasonable merit, but I am by no means exceptional. And even in the Irish National League, I would be a bit overmatched. So I headed out to right field, batting somewhere in the lower middle part of the order. And I played right field to start. But then at the end of the tournament, there's just absolutely no pitching left for any teams. This is a very common problem. I'm sure you're all well aware of. And so I was asked to pitch. I had started pitching earlier that year. I stepped up to the mound, and I fired a pitch in. And as I landed, my cleat hit the soil in front of the mound, and the bottom level of my cleat, this old pair of Mizunos I'd won since high school baseball, tore off. And I did not have a backup pair of cleats. To his credit, the umpire, an Irish umpire, offered to let me borrow his cleats. And so mid-game, the umpire and the pitcher swapped cleats. And I then got out of the inning, no runs allowed. One of the best innings I've ever pitched in my life. I asked whether I could maybe buy these cleats off of him. You know, I could see a baseball future ahead of myself for the first time in my life. But instead, I limped home in my trainers. But it was an incredibly enjoyable experience playing on the Emerald Isle and doing so for an Irish team. It was, as someone with Irish roots, it was something that made my dad proud, and it's a really fond memory for me.
Mr-baseball.com, correct?
That's us.
Thank you so much for joining us. I do think that our listeners right now have a much better sense of what's going on in Europe with these club tournaments and with the national teams. And we just want to get everybody sort of familiar with that. So thank you so much for taking the time to sort of educate some ignorant Americans.
I thoroughly enjoyed it, and as someone who went to US University and spends quite a bit of time in the US, it's always a joy to talk European baseball, or just baseball at all.
That was Gabriel Fidler of MrBaseball.com, Mr-Baseball.com. That website is the place to go to stay up to date on baseball over in Europe. I'm Rick Becker, and this has been episode 107 of the Irish Baseball Podcast.